You can't let your daughter lounge out there like that. It's indecent. Cynthia Bellamy, president of our HOA board, stood at the edge of my driveway with a clipboard pressed against her chest, her lips pursed like she was delivering some moral decree. Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac, loud enough for half the street to hear. She didn't even flinch when I caught her phone angled toward my backyard. The lens pointed where my daughter had been sunbathing just minutes earlier. The smug tilt of her head told me she thought she was untouchable. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my fist. I just said 6 quiet words that wiped the smirk off her face. Your camera still pings back to me? The clipboard lowered a fraction. She blinked, realizing I wasn't another easy target. I'd built the systems that routed this entire neighborhood's wireless infrastructure when the developer first cut deals with local contractors. Every router, every access point, they all carried my fingerprints. And when her phone tried to connect to our shared signal, I saw everything. If you're watching this right now, don't scroll away. You need to hear what happened next, because the same people running my neighborhood could be running yours tomorrow. Subscribe now before they bury stories like this one. My name's Daniel Mercer. I'm a licensed electrical engineer, 30 years in the trade, and I don't pick fights. But I don't forget either. I designed grid systems for half the hospitals in this county. I understand power better than most, and how it fails when the wrong hands hold the switch. That's why this wasn't just about my daughter catching sunlight in her own backyard. It was about the humiliation etched across her face when she realized someone had filmed her without consent. Cynthia tried to frame it as a community standards issue, but all I saw was my child's shoulders collapsing as she scrambled inside, clutching a towel against her skin like armor. She's 17. She should have been worried about college applications, not whether grown adults were plastering her privacy across HOA violation forms. And that bench in the backyard, the one my daughter had dragged beside the flower bed before she stretched out in the sun, that's not just wooden screws. My father built it the summer before cancer took him. He told me it would outlast him, that it should carry the weight of 3 generations if we cared for it right. My daughter loved it because it smelled faintly of cedar when it rained. She called it Granddad's bench. That was where she felt safe, until Cynthia pointed a lens at it. So, when Cynthia raised her voice and barked about fines and improper displays visible to neighbors, she wasn't just shaming my daughter. She was spitting on a piece of my father's legacy, twisting the memory of a man who worked 2 jobs to give us that home. I locked eyes with her, steady. I wanted her to see. What I saw, the line she had crossed, the place where neighborhood politics ended and criminal violation began. You'll regret this complaint, she hissed, scribbling something onto her clipboard, still trying to hold ground. But I'd already made a silent vow as my daughter sobbed upstairs. Cynthia thought she had the board behind her, thought she could twist rules into weapons and dress up harassment as governance. She didn't realize she'd picked a fight with someone who built the bones of this community, literally wired it into existence. And more than that, she didn't realize the one thing stronger than bylaws or fines: a father who won't let his daughter carry shame she doesn't deserve. The first crack in Cynthia Bellamy's control happened right there, on my driveway, when she realized she couldn't bully me into silence. What she didn't know yet was how far I was willing to go, and how many neighbors were already watching her with suspicion. The silence after Cynthia walked away was heavier than the humidity settling over the cul-de-sac. Neighbors had paused their evening routines, half hidden behind blinds and porch rails, watching the confrontation unfold. I knew exactly what was coming next. When an HOA president feels challenged, retaliation isn't a possibility. It's a guarantee. By morning, the signs appeared. Laminated sheets, taped to stop signs, stapled to the bulletin board outside the pool house, even wedged into mail slots. Each one carried the same bold headline: Community Warning, Inappropriate Behavior in Backyard Spaces. No names were printed, but the target was clear. The flyers claimed that certain residents were creating unsafe conditions for families and violating standards of decency. My daughter's world shrank to whispers overnight. I found one fluttering against the chain-link fence by the basketball court. I peeled it free, the tape snapping loud in the quiet morning. The pool house doors creaked open behind me. A couple of residents slipped out, coffee cups in hand, their eyes skimming past mine with that practiced avoidance people use when they don't want to be involved. But I saw the shame flicker there too, not for me, for themselves. The pool house had always been the neighborhood's heart. Birthday parties, summer cookouts, late-night meetings. I'd wired the lighting there myself 15 years ago, long before Cynthia inherited her clipboard and crown. Now the place carried a different weight. The flyers stapled to the corkboard turned it into a stage for public shaming. My daughter's safety net of childhood memories, splashing cannonballs, chlorine-scented laughter, was tainted by suspicion, manufactured and broadcast by one woman's spite. I crumpled the flyer in my fist, the edges cutting into my palm. This wasn't just about one violation or one photograph anymore. Cynthia was shaping the narrative, painting my daughter as the problem, and the neighborhood was swallowing it in silence. She thought she could get away with it because shame spreads faster than truth. She hadn't calculated for me. I wasn't the type to chase arguments online or scribble rebuttals in red ink. My training had taught me something sharper. Systems leave footprints. Whether it's a faulty transformer or a manipulative HOA, the wiring always betrays its weakest points. And I'd already started mapping Cynthia's weak points. But there was something else at play. As I tore down one sign after another, I noticed who lingered nearby. Not everyone avoided me. Across the pool deck, leaning against the railing, stood Paul Hensley, HOA secretary. His polo shirt was wrinkled, clipboard tucked under his arm, like he'd rather throw it in the trash. He didn't look at me directly, but his hand twitched when another neighbor stapled a fresh flyer beside the bulletin board. A pause, a sigh. Then he walked inside without a word. That was the first crack in Cynthia's armor I hadn't forced myself. Someone inside the board wasn't comfortable. I gathered the crumpled flyers into a pile and carried them to the trash bin by the tennis courts. The morning sun reflected off the laminated sheets, a mockery of permanence. My daughter had refused to leave her room, the blinds drawn tight. Each sign was a nail Cynthia tried to hammer into her confidence. But here's the thing about nails. They can be pulled back out, one by one. And when you know how to build foundations, you know how to rebuild what others try to destroy. By the time I left the pool house, my resolve had hardened. Cynthia's campaign wasn't clever. It was predictable. Smear, escalate, isolate. But I had something she didn't. The technical receipts. The proof her camera had pinged our network. The record of her stepping over lines the bylaws never gave her the right to cross. As I passed the flower beds edging the pool deck, I caught the faint cedar scent drifting from my backyard, carried on the breeze. It anchored me again. That bench wasn't just a reminder of my father's work. It was a promise. He'd built strong because he wanted his family to stand strong. The pool house, once a place of community, had become Cynthia's stage. Fine. If she wanted a stage, I'd make sure the lights turned back on her. If the pool house had become Cynthia's stage, then the next act played out in the community garden. It was Saturday morning, the one time the HOA board liked to parade their service around by planting new flowers while neighbors strolled by. I showed up with my gloves tucked into my belt, not to plant, but to watch. Cynthia thrived on visibility, and I wanted to see who stood in her shadow. The community garden sat in the middle of the neighborhood, boxed in by brick planters and a gazebo that leaned slightly from years of sun and rain. Kids used to play tag between the rows of roses. Now, it felt like a battleground. The flyers Cynthia had plastered earlier in the week still lingered on the edges, half torn down, half replaced, fluttering like banners of a war no one wanted to name. Cynthia herself was there, of course, directing volunteers as if she were a general on campaign. Not there, closer to the signpost. "We need symmetry," she barked, her clipboard raised like a scepter. She didn't look at me when I arrived, but I caught the tightening of her jaw, the deliberate way she angled her shoulders away. A petty queen protecting her crown. And then there was Paul Hensley, the conflicted secretary. He knelt near the mulch pile, sunglasses perched low on his nose. His posture told me everything Cynthia's words didn't. He wasn't just tired, he was cornered. When she shouted orders, his hands trembled slightly as he pressed soil around a root ball. When she moved closer, he hunched in, as if trying to disappear into his own shirt. Yet when a teenager approached to ask about watering, Paul's voice softened, almost apologetic, before he cut himself off mid-sentence and glanced toward Cynthia like a man checking for tripwires. That's when I knew he wasn't loyal to her. He was trapped. I leaned against the gazebo post, arms crossed, and let the scene play out. I wanted Paul to feel my presence, to remember I'd seen his hesitation at the pool house. Sure enough, his eyes flicked up once, then darted away. His shoulders tightened as if he'd been caught. He shoved his sunglasses higher, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. But the gesture didn't mask the truth. His body language betrayed him. The half steps backward when Cynthia barked too loud, the shallow breaths when she pointed toward him as an example of bored commitment. Cynthia didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. Power blinds people like her. She preferred the illusion of control to the reality of cracks forming beneath her feet. But I noticed. I studied him the way I'd study a failing circuit. Subtle flickers, the hum before overload. The garden had always symbolized community pride. Families donated benches, painted stones, even the gazebo itself was built with pooled funds. That's why Cynthia staged her authority here, because she thought she owned the image of unity. But now it only highlighted division. Some neighbors dug half-heartedly, their eyes sliding toward me like they wanted to speak but didn't dare. Others avoided me altogether, afraid of guilt by association. And in the middle, Paul carried the weight of a man who knew too much but couldn't yet decide if telling the truth would save him or bury him. I crouched near a planter, brushing dirt from the cedar trim I'd helped install years ago. My father's hands had been there too, steady and patient. He'd taught me that wood tells the truth if you know how to read it, every knot, every grain. People weren't so different. And Paul's truth was written all over his slumped posture and clenched jaw. When the morning wrapped, Cynthia congratulated herself loudly, boasting about restoring decency. Paul stood off to the side, clipboard hugged to his chest like a shield. He avoided eye contact with her, but he also avoided me. He lingered, pacing near the mulch pile long after others left, finally dropping his sunglasses into his pocket with a sigh that seemed to pull his whole frame downward. He hadn't chosen a side yet, but he would. I could feel it. And when he did, Cynthia's own secretary would become the proof she never saw coming. Paul's sigh still echoed in my head when I left the community garden, but the next clash didn't wait for him to make a choice. Cynthia always struck first. By Monday morning, I returned from work to find a bright orange violation notice taped across my front door. Not slipped into the mailbox, not folded discreetly, but taped at eye level in bold letters. Unsanctioned structure and improper use of outdoor space. She was calling out the bench. My father's bench. The words blurred as I read them, rage tightening my chest. Structure meant anything that wasn't approved by the HOA's architectural committee. Cynthia had twisted a family heirloom into contraband. According to her notice, the bench would need to be removed immediately, or fines would begin accruing at $100 per day. She'd weaponized bureaucracy against memory. I tore the notice free, the tape ripping like a wound, and stepped back onto the cul-de-sac. Neighbors pretended not to see, though I caught curtains shifting and shadows retreating. Cynthia wanted a spectacle, and she got it. But she underestimated the kind of man who builds power systems for a living. When you understand how networks connect, you also understand how they collapse. That evening, I walked to the clubhouse where board meetings were held. The place reeked of stale carpet cleaner and cheap coffee, but the bulletin board was fresh, another violation notice pinned for all to read, with my address highlighted. It wasn't enough to fine me. Cynthia wanted humiliation stitched into the fabric of the neighborhood. She strutted inside a few minutes later, her heels clicking like a countdown, clipboard clutched tight, chin high. "Some residents think they're above the rules," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying into the empty air of the clubhouse foyer. She knew I was there. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I scanned the security camera mounted above the entrance. Old unit. I'd installed its wiring years ago when the HOA wanted coverage for liability protection. The timestamp flickered slightly, out of sync with real time. A flaw Cynthia wouldn't recognize, but one I could track. The irony was sharp. The same systems she leaned on for power were the very ones I understood better than she ever would. The clubhouse had always been more theater than governance. Board meetings looked official, but the walls told another story. Stacks of unused forms, out-of-date bylaws, a printer jammed with expired ink. Cynthia operated on intimidation, not order. But intimidation leaves fingerprints, and the moment she turned my father's bench into her battlefield, She created the leverage I needed. I stood near the corkboard as she pretended to shuffle papers, my hand brushing the edge of another posted notice. Behind me, footsteps echoed. Paul entered, slower than Cynthia, his clipboard hanging limp at his side. He gave me a brief glance, just a flicker, but his mouth tightened when he saw the posted violation. His thumb rubbed the edge of the clipboard nervously, as if erasing invisible lines. Cynthia launched into another lecture about preserving property values, her voice swelling in the hollow room. But her words skimmed past me. I was already piecing the system together. The wireless logs, the out-of-date security cameras, the sloppy timestamps. Proof was building itself in the same way a current builds along a live wire. The clubhouse, symbolic of Cynthia's authority, felt less like a fortress and more like a decaying circuit box ready to short. I'd expose her not with anger, but with precision. I didn't need shouting matches or Facebook wars. I needed data. And in a neighborhood where the HOA thrived on intimidation, hard evidence would turn fear into doubt. Paul shifted again, leaning against the doorframe. His knuckles whitened around the clipboard, his eyes flicking between Cynthia's swagger and my silence. His body said what his voice didn't. He hated being part of this charade. And sooner or later, that guilt would spill. I left the clubhouse without a word, the orange violation notice folded into my pocket. Cynthia thought she'd cornered me by targeting the bench. She thought humiliation and fines would force compliance. What she didn't see was the network tightening around her, every ping, every timestamp, every witness she ignored, and me. I wasn't backing down. The fight had only just begun. I walked home from the clubhouse with the violation notice crumpled in my fist, but the anger burning in me wasn't directionless anymore. Cynthia thought she'd written the end of the story by targeting my father's bench. She hadn't realized she'd just handed me the perfect entry point. The bench was my wound, yes, but it was also my leverage. And leverage, in the hands of an engineer, becomes pressure that no faulty system can withstand. The new setting for this battle was my own workspace, the garage. Not the dusty garage where TV dramas have characters find secret files, but my fully functional workshop. A place where I repaired faulty transformers, ran diagnostics, and kept the kind of equipment most board presidents would never recognize. I flipped the switch, and the hum of the servers filled the space, steady and grounding. My daughter lingered in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, eyes swollen from days of silent anger. She didn't say a word, but her presence was enough. This wasn't just about wiring or rules. It was about restoring her dignity. I sat down at my workstation and pulled up the logs. The neighborhood network still ran partly on the backbone I designed years ago. While the HOA might control the surface, the skeleton beneath it remained mine. Every device pinged across routers and access points, each one leaving a digital fingerprint. Cynthia's phone, with its smug little lens, had left a trail on the day she filmed my daughter. The packets didn't lie, time-stamped, sourced, and routed straight through the system she claimed to govern. Discovery didn't come with fanfare. It came with a blinking cursor and rows of data only I could read with confidence. There it was, the exact moment her device had accessed the shared band, connected to the pool house node, and transferred files. She hadn't just filmed without consent. She'd done it through the very infrastructure she had no idea was still tied to me. This wasn't a violation notice I could rip off a door. This was evidence. Hard, indisputable evidence that would hold up when the time came to push back. I leaned back in my chair, the smell of machine oil and solder lingering in the air, and felt the weight shift inside me. Until that moment, I'd been reacting, ripping down flyers, tearing notices, standing silent while Cynthia staged her parades. But now the current had reversed. I had the spark she couldn't control. From the corner of my eye, I caught my daughter's hand brushing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked small in the doorway, but her chin was raised. "Did you find something?" she whispered, her voice raw. I nodded once. Enough. The garage had always been more than a workspace. My father used to say that machines don't lie. People do. He'd taught me to listen to the hum of a motor, the way it betrayed its health. Cynthia's voice could thunder through flyers and speeches, but the data told a different story, and I would make sure that story saw the light. The victory strategy was no longer a vague plan. It was forming in sharp edges. Cynthia had crossed into illegality, and I had the logs to prove it. That meant when she tried to find me for the bench or smear my daughter with innuendo, I could counter with something stronger than words. I could counter with proof that she had misused her authority and broken trust in the very community she claimed to protect. I saved the files, double-backed them to encrypted drives, and sat in silence for a long time. The bench in the backyard, my father's cedar-scented legacy, wasn't just under threat. It was now the fulcrum on which the entire battle turned. Cynthia thought she could paint us as indecent, but I'd paint her for what she was, a leader who violated the very families she swore to safeguard. As I shut down the workstation and locked the drives into a fireproof box, I knew the escalation had reached its turning point. The HOA president had pushed too far, and the system she relied on to dominate this neighborhood had just betrayed her. I locked the fireproof box and set it back on the shelf, the weight of it both literal and symbolic. For the first time since Cynthia had shoved her clipboard into my driveway, I felt like the balance had shifted. But evidence on a hard drive meant nothing if I didn't protect it and prepare for the storm that would follow. Cynthia would never back down quietly. The next wave came faster than I expected. 2 days later, I returned home from a job site to find a crowd near the mailbox cluster at the entrance to our subdivision. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering in low voices. Bright new flyers had been taped across every panel. Unsafe behavior alert. Parents, be vigilant. My address was listed in bold this time. No innuendo, no half suggestions. Just a direct accusation aimed squarely at my family. The setting was cruelly chosen. That mailbox cluster wasn't just a row of steel boxes. It was the neighborhood's daily ritual. Kids rode bikes there with parents trailing behind. Retirees gathered their magazines. Delivery slips waited for pickup. It was the one place every resident had to visit. Cynthia had turned it into a scarlet letter nailed in public view. I pushed through the cluster and tore one flyer down, my jaw clenched tight. Neighbors avoided my eyes, but I felt the ripple moving through them. Sympathy from some, doubt from others, silence from too many. That's how smear campaigns worked. Sow suspicion, watch trust rot. Paul was there too, standing half in the shade, half in the light. Clipboard under his arm again, his posture said everything. His shoulders slumped as if the flyers weighed on him personally. He didn't step forward, didn't stop Cynthia's smear, but his eyes followed me when I carried the torn flyer back toward my truck. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, he lowered his head and rubbed the back of his neck, caught between fear and conscience. I didn't need his confession yet. His hesitation was enough to confirm that Cynthia wasn't acting with full board support. Cracks were spreading. Still, my daughter saw those flyers when she left for school that morning. She came back pale, her backpack slipping from her shoulder. Dad, everyone saw. Her voice cracked, and that was it for me. No father should ever have to watch his child shrink under the weight of lies. That night, I sat in the kitchen with the fireproof box beside me. I opened the drive and scrolled through the logs again, each time stamped like a heartbeat. The proof was airtight. Cynthia had violated not just trust, but law. She'd used her phone on the shared system to film my daughter, and the system had recorded her attempt like an unblinking witness. The kitchen smelled faintly of cedar oil from the egg polish I used on the bench years ago, my father's bench. That smell wrapped around me like a reminder. Dignity wasn't negotiable. He built things to last, not to bend under bullies. I owed it to him, and to my daughter, to see this fight through, no matter how long it dragged. The mailbox cluster had been Cynthia's attempt at public execution. Fine. But public humiliation works both ways. If she wanted the community to watch, I'd make sure they saw the truth with their own eyes. I saved fresh copies of the logs and printed out network maps. Lines and timestamps stretched across the pages like blueprints of her deceit. I didn't need to embellish, didn't need to twist. The data spoke for itself, and when the right moment came, I'd put it where no neighbor could ignore it, right in the same public spaces she'd used against us. As I slid the printouts into a folder, I heard movement on the porch. My daughter had left the window cracked in her room, and I caught her silhouette against the blinds, watching me from upstairs. She didn't ask questions this time. She just stayed there, silent, trusting. That trust anchored me more than any evidence ever could. Cynthia thought her flyers would crush us under shame. What she didn't see was the resolve it sparked instead. The mailbox cluster might have carried her accusations today, but tomorrow it would carry my proof. The folder of network maps sat on the kitchen table overnight, like a sealed weapon waiting for its first strike. But weapons aren't useful without timing. Cynthia controlled the stage, and if I moved too early, she'd spin it into another smear. I needed precision. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Saturday morning, the community gym was open for the board's fitness and wellness initiative, another excuse for them to show they were improving quality of life. I went not for exercise, but for reconnaissance. The gym was small, a converted clubhouse wing with mirrors lining the walls and treadmills humming faintly. It was one of the few places where residents and board members mixed without pretense. I wasn't surprised to see Paul there, hunched on the stationary bike, pedaling without rhythm. His polo was half untucked, sweat dripping down his temple, not from exertion, but from tension. When he spotted me in the mirror, his legs slowed until the pedals coasted under him. He wiped his brow with a towel, then gestured subtly toward the corner near the water cooler. I followed. His body language was restless, weight shifting from one foot to the other, fingers drumming against his clipboard even though there was no meeting to record. He kept glancing at the door, as if expecting Cynthia to materialize with her clipboard raised like a sword. Finally he spoke, voice low, words clipped. "You're not wrong about the flyers, or the bench." He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. "Cynthia?" She pushed the board to approve the notices. Said if we didn't sign off, she'd accuse us of ignoring indecency. His voice cracked at the word. He rubbed the back of his neck, the same nervous tick I'd seen at the mailbox cluster. I didn't want to sign, but she cornered me, said if I didn't, I'd lose my position, maybe even face liability. There it was, the confession I'd been waiting for, a conflicted ally turning into an unwitting witness. I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch. Paul shifted again, eyes darting toward the mirrors where our reflections looked like two conspirators in a glass box. His voice dropped further. "She's been recording meetings without approval, using her phone, sometimes the clubhouse cameras. She says it's for records, but she edits clips before showing residents, makes it look worse than it is." His shoulders slumped. "I've seen the raw files. I know she cut things out." My pulse kicked hard, not from shock but from validation. My logs were proof of her intrusion into private space. Paul's confession tied it to a broader pattern of manipulation. Together, they built a case no smear flyer could erase. He looked at me finally, eyes bloodshot, mouth tight. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I didn't sign up to be part of this circus." His hands shook as he gripped the towel, twisting it like he was wringing water from it. "But if I go against her, I could lose everything. She knows how to bury people." I leaned back against the cooler, keeping my voice level. "She already buried my daughter." The words seemed to hit him like a current. His face flushed, and he looked down at the floor tiles. "You're right," he muttered, "and she won't stop unless someone calls her out." He reached into his folder, hesitated, then slid out a folded sheet. His fingers lingered before he let go. It was a draft agenda for the next board meeting, Cynthia's notes scribbled in the margins. Underlined twice. Escalate fines, bench removal mandatory. Below it, another note. Push narrative, unsafe family environment. Paul's hand twitched once more, then dropped to his side. "That's all I can give you right now, but it's enough, isn't it?" I folded the page carefully, sliding it into my folder beside the network logs. Enough? It was more than enough. It was the bridge between her lies and the truth waiting to unravel them. Paul exhaled like a man lifting a weight off his chest. He didn't say anything else. He just walked back to the stationary bike, sat down, and started pedaling again. Eyes locked on the mirror, as if daring himself to look at the man he'd just become. I left the gym with the folder heavier than before, not with paper, but with certainty. Cynthia had cracks running straight through her foundation, and now I had someone inside confirming it. I walked out of the gym with Paul's folded agenda burning in my pocket, the Florida sun pressing down, like a spotlight. For the first time, I wasn't just carrying evidence from my systems. I had proof from inside Cynthia's fortress. Her own secretary had handed me a piece of her playbook. The question now wasn't if I could dismantle her smear campaign, but how. The next setting wasn't a clubhouse or mailbox cluster. It was the public library on the edge of town, a place Cynthia rarely touched. She thrived where she could control whispers, not where paper trails lived in neat rows of binders and ordinances. I sat at one of the long oak tables, the smell of ink and old carpet filling the air, my laptop open beside a stack of local statutes. The librarian gave me a nod but didn't interrupt. She'd seen my kind before, the resident trying to decode the labyrinth of HOA bylaws. I already had the data logs proving Cynthia's phone had piggybacked the network while she filmed my daughter. Paul's notes gave me her intent, to escalate fines and smear us as an unsafe family. But here, buried in municipal code, I found the final connection. An HOA president can't unilaterally issue violation notices without documented board approval. And more than that, recording residents without consent violated both the HOA's own charter and state privacy laws. Cynthia's authority wasn't just cruel, it was invalid. Every engineer knows that a system isn't taken down by brute force. You find the overlooked circuit, the one wire that completes the loop, and you cut it clean. That's what this was. Cynthia had been operating as if she was the HOA itself, but the statute said otherwise. Her smug flyers, her violation notices, they were all written on paper thinner than she realized. I spread the documents out across the table, tracing the lines between them, my logs, Paul's agenda, municipal code. Together they built a map, one that didn't just show her misconduct, but proved she had no standing to enforce the punishments she'd threatened. And if she lacked standing, every fine she'd levied, every accusation she'd plastered across the community, could come crashing back on her like a snapped power line. I pictured my daughter again, hunched on the bench she called Granddad's, clutching her towel against her chest. Cynthia wanted her shame to be permanent, but shame only works if it stays hidden. I wasn't hiding. That night, I brought the folder back to my garage workshop. The hum of servers filled the air, steady as a heartbeat. I laid everything out on the workbench like components before assembly. Each piece had its role: Paul's reluctant confession, the agenda with her own handwriting, the time-stamped network logs, and the municipal codes printed fresh from the library printer. I lined them up until the picture became undeniable. The preparation phase wasn't glamorous. It was long hours of cross-checking, marking statutes, highlighting phrases, and saving backup copies to encrypted drives. My daughter wandered in. At one point, still quiet, but she watched me work from the doorway. When she finally asked, "Is it enough to stop her?" I didn't hesitate. "It's enough to bury her lies," I said. The library had given me the law. Paul had given me her intent. My own expertise had given me the technical proof. Together, they created a framework stronger than any smear flyer she could tape to a mailbox. The victory strategy was no longer abstract. It was ready. Cynthia had built her campaign on intimidation and illusion, but illusions collapse under light. I wasn't going to fight her on her terms, screaming matches in cul-de-sacs, gossip at the pool house. I was going to drag her into a place she couldn't control, a room with rules, records, and an audience she couldn't manipulate. As I packed the folder into a briefcase, the cedar scent from the bench drifted faintly through the open garage window. My father's legacy wasn't just sitting in the backyard anymore. It was here, fueling every choice, every late-night preparation. He built things to last. Now it was my turn to prove that truth lasts longer than lies. Cynthia had turned the neighborhood into her stage. At the next board meeting, I'd turn the spotlight back on her. The decision was made. The next board meeting wouldn't be just another evening of Cynthia's lectures and staged outrage. It would be the place where her campaign against my daughter began to unravel in front of the very neighbors she thought she controlled. But a plan like this needed precision. Engineers don't flip switches without testing the circuit first. And I wasn't about to go in blind. The new setting was neutral ground, a coffee shop just outside the neighborhood gates. It wasn't owned by anyone in the subdivision, which meant Cynthia's claws didn't reach that far. The air smelled of roasted beans and faint cinnamon. The background noise a mix of clinking mugs and hushed conversation. I picked a corner table and opened my briefcase. Inside, the folder of evidence lay like a coiled wire, ready to release its current. One by one, I laid out the pieces again. Paul's agenda with Cynthia's notes, my network logs, and the municipal codes I'd copied at the library. The barista glanced at the spread like I was plotting a trial, which, in a way, I was. This wasn't about shouting louder. It was about walking into that meeting with undeniable truth, lined up in sequence, impossible to refute. Paul arrived 20 minutes later, his shirt untucked, hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd wrestled with the decision all morning. He slid into the seat across from me, eyes darting around the cafe like he expected Cynthia to materialize from behind the pastry case. His body told the story before his words did. Slumped shoulders, restless fingers tapping the table, a knee bouncing beneath the surface. "She's tightening control," he muttered finally. "Sent an email last night, told the board to stand united and approve the fines against you at the meeting. Wants to force a vote to make it official." His jaw flexed. "But she didn't circulate minutes, didn't follow procedure. She just barked orders." I let him speak, watching his nerves unravel. When he finally met my eyes, I slid the folder toward him, flipping it open to the network logs. "This is what she didn't count on," I said, voice steady. "Time-stamped records, her device, the exact moment she filmed my daughter." Paul's face drained of color. He rubbed the back of his neck, just like at the mailbox cluster, and whispered, "She's finished if that gets out." "Only if it's done right," I countered. "At the meeting, in front of everyone. No rumors, no whispers, just the facts." He stared at the pages for a long moment, then pulled out his own folder. A thin packet slid across the table. Internal HOA emails, with Cynthia's name plastered across the sender line. In one, she bragged about controlling the narrative. In another, she dismissed concerns about legality. "Residents don't know the bylaws well enough to fight us." The barista refilled my mug, and I almost laughed at the absurdity. A coffee shop table had become the war room for the biggest fight of my life. Paul leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. "If I hand this over in the meeting, she'll come after me too." "She already has," I said. "You're just deciding whether you're going to keep helping her do it." His hands tightened on the edge of the table, knuckles white. Then, slowly, he nodded. The decision was made. He'd step into the light with me. By the time I left the cafe, the plan was clear. The board meeting would be my stage, but not in the way Cynthia intended. She wanted a vote to rubber stamp her punishment. Instead, she'd be forced to face a wall of evidence. My technical logs, her scribbled agenda, the municipal code, and now her own damning emails. As I walked back through the neighborhood's gates, the sight of the cedar bench in my backyard steadied me. My daughter sat there quietly, homework balanced on her knees, the late afternoon sun catching her hair. She looked up when I passed, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the flicker of a smile. The shame Cynthia tried to plaster on her was starting to peel away. And soon, the entire neighborhood would see whose name really belonged on those flyers. The flicker of my daughter's smile stayed with me through the evening, but I knew the real test hadn't come yet. Cynthia had her vote scheduled for Tuesday night at the clubhouse, and everything depended on what I did before then. Preparation was over. This was the execution phase. The new setting was my workplace, the electrical contractor's office downtown. It wasn't glamorous, just a squat building lined with drafting tables, whiteboards scrawled with voltage calculations, and the hum of fluorescent lights. But it was Meet Arena. This was where my skills carried authority, not Cynthia's clipboard theatrics. I cleared a drafting table and spread everything out like blueprints. The network logs, Paul's agenda, the emails he'd slipped me, and the municipal codes. Each document had its own weight, but together they formed a system, interconnected, precise. I drew arrows between them, building a chain of logic strong enough to hold under the pressure Cynthia would apply. Step 1. Establish authority. Cynthia had no legal standing to issue unilateral notices. That was spelled out in the statutes, and I had the highlighted pages ready. Step 2. Prove intent. Her handwritten agenda showed her goal was to escalate fines and smear my family, not preserve decency. Step 3. Provide hard evidence. The network logs captured the moment her device accessed the system while filming my daughter. Step 4. Corroboration. Paul's emails revealed her pattern of manipulation. It wasn't just a defense, it was an indictment. The hum of the office grew louder in the quiet, or maybe it was just my pulse syncing with it. I knew Cynthia would try to cut me off, spin the crowd, twist every word. But engineers don't argue with circuits, they show the current. My role wasn't to outshout her, it was to make the truth undeniable. I pulled out my phone and tested the projector we kept for client presentations. I loaded the logs into a slide deck, each timestamp clean and visible. Then the agenda notes, Cynthia's handwriting underlined in red, then the emails projected in full. There would be no he said, she said, only the record displayed for all to see. Paul arrived late, his car headlights cutting across the parking lot before he slipped inside. He looked exhausted, but resolved. He set his clipboard on the table beside mine and pointed to the highlighted statutes. She doesn't know the law as well as she thinks. If you lead with this, she'll stumble. His voice was steady, but his hands fidgeted with the pen clipped to his shirt pocket. I nodded. And when she stumbles, the rest will hit harder. He exhaled slowly. I'll back you when the time comes. That was all I needed. By midnight, the plan was airtight. We rehearsed the sequence like engineers testing a load-bearing design. Evidence first, intent second, violation third, corroboration last. The order mattered. It would build momentum, strip away her defenses, and leave no space for her to pivot. I drove home under streetlights flickering against the asphalt, the briefcase locked in the passenger seat. The subdivision was quiet, unnaturally so. Flyers had stopped appearing since Paul's hesitation cracked her confidence, but silence wasn't victory. It was the calm before impact. I parked and walked to the backyard. The cedar bench stood in the moonlight, dew already beating along its surface. I sat, letting the wood creak beneath me, and thought of my father. He'd taught me that. Electricity is invisible until it finds a path. Cynthia had tried to make shame my daughter's path. Instead, I would make truth hers. When I finally rose, the decision was locked in. Tomorrow night, the clubhouse would no longer be Cynthia's stage. It would be mine. And when the lights dimmed and the projector clicked on, the entire neighborhood would see her for what she really was. The clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs scraped against the tiled floor. Neighbors murmured in tight clusters. And the air buzzed with that peculiar tension you only feel before a storm. Cynthia had summoned the entire community for what she billed as a decency enforcement vote. And she walked the aisle like she already owned the outcome. Clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a self-satisfied smile, she looked every bit the monarch of her tiny empire. I sat in the front row with my briefcase at my feet, Paul one chair over. His posture was stiff, but he was here, and that mattered. My daughter hadn't come, too raw, too hurt, but the scent of cedar polish clung faintly to my jacket. I'd rubbed it into the bench before leaving, carrying the memory of my father with me. That weight anchored me as Cynthia tapped the microphone, silencing the crowd. "Good evening," she began, her voice dripping with authority. "We're here to address ongoing violations of community standards, particularly the inappropriate use of backyard space visible from public areas. The board will now vote on mandatory removal of unauthorized structures and the issuing of fines." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I caught eyes darting toward me, some sympathetic, some curious, some cold with judgment. Cynthia leaned into the microphone, scanning the room like a predator. "We will not allow our neighborhood to be degraded by indecency." She motioned toward the board members behind her. Paul shifted in his seat at the end of the row, his clipboard balanced on his knees. He didn't look up. His body told me everything, his leg bouncing, fingers gripping the pen until his knuckles whitened. He was ready. I stood. The scrape of my chair echoed, and the room fell quiet. Cynthia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she snapped. "You'll have your chance, Mr. Mercer. Right now, the board is—" "No," I said, voice carrying steady. "Right now, the community deserves the truth." I lifted the remote from my pocket and clicked. The projector at the back wall hummed to life, light flooding across the pull-down screen. Cynthia's eyes widened as the first slide appeared, a clean timestamp, the digital log of her device connecting to the pool house node at the exact moment my daughter had been outside. "This," I said, pointing, "is the network record of Mrs. Bellamy's phone accessing the system while she was filming my daughter without consent." Gasps broke across the room. A woman in the second row covered her mouth, whispering to her husband. Someone else muttered, "That's illegal." Cynthia slammed her clipboard onto the podium. "Fabrication," she barked. "Technical mumbo-jumbo meant to confuse." Another click. The screen filled with her handwritten agenda, the words, "Escalate fines, bench removal mandatory," underlined twice. Below, in smaller script, "Push narrative, unsafe family environment." Her own notes, I said, not about decency, about destroying reputations. The crowd erupted. Some shouted questions, others whispered angrily. Cynthia's face flushed crimson. She pounded the podium, trying to drown out the noise. Paul rose slowly from his seat at the board table. His voice shook at first, but grew steadier with each word. I can confirm those notes are authentic. I've seen her draft them, and I've also seen her alter meeting recordings to mislead residents. His hands trembled as he held up the internal emails, then set them on the table. She told us residents don't know the bylaws well enough to fight us. But here's the truth. She's been acting without proper board authority for months. The room exploded. Neighbors turned on one another, some shouting support for me, others demanding Cynthia step down. A man near the back yelled, "You filmed a kid?" And the anger in his voice cracked through the chaos. Cynthia tried to seize control, waving her arms, her voice shrill. "Lies! All lies!" But the projector betrayed her again, flashing the municipal statute I'd highlighted, the line that stripped her of authority to issue unilateral fines. "Every notice she's posted," I said, voice cutting through the clamor, "is invalid. Every flyer, every threat, void. She's been abusing power she doesn't have." Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Eyes turned from me to Cynthia, and for the first time, she looked small. Not a queen, but a woman cornered by her own arrogance. Her hand shook as she reached for the microphone, but no words came. Paul's shoulders sagged with relief, and I felt the weight of my father's bench settle steady inside me. This wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about restoring dignity to my daughter and truth to a community that had forgotten how to see it. Cynthia's hand hovered over the microphone, but nothing came out. The silence after my last words stretched across the clubhouse like a live wire ready to snap. Neighbors stared at her, then at me, then at the screen still glowing with statutes and proof. Authority doesn't dissolve with a bang. It collapses under the weight of truth, and I watched hers buckle in real time. The board meeting dissolved into chaos. Some residents shouted for her resignation. Others demanded a formal investigation. A few just sat in stunned silence, realizing the woman they had trusted to protect community values had been weaponizing rules for her own vendetta. Cynthia slammed her clipboard shut, her knuckles white, and stormed out the side door without another word. The door rattled on its hinges as it closed behind her. Paul remained at the table, shoulders slumped, face pale but free. He didn't need to say more. His testimony had broken the spell Cynthia held over the board. The other members looked dazed, scribbling notes, whispering among themselves like children caught skipping class. For the first time, their authority looked fragile, exposed. I gathered my papers quietly, slid the remote back into my pocket, and closed the briefcase with a click that echoed louder than I expected. Neighbors began to approach me. Some apologized, shame in their eyes for believing the flyers. Others offered thanks, hands clasping my shoulder, voices tight with anger at Cynthia's betrayal. One older man muttered, "Took someone with backbone to finally call her out." But the moment that stayed with me came after the crowd thinned. A mother with 2 kids trailing behind her stopped near the door. She didn't speak right away, just looked at me with the raw relief of someone who realized her family was safer, because someone else had stood their ground. "Your daughter's brave," she whispered finally. Then she left, her words lingering long after she was gone. The next day the signs were gone, not ripped down in anger, but quietly, almost sheepishly, removed by residents who no longer wanted to be complicit. At the mailbox cluster, the same steel panels Cynthia had once plastered with accusations now stood bare, almost cleansed. The scarlet letter had been scrubbed away, replaced by silence and sidelong nods that carried a different weight. Respect. Back home, I walked into the backyard where the cedar bench waited. My daughter sat there, sunlight spilling across her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't shrinking from the world. She was facing it. She looked up at me, eyes clearer, and asked, "Is it over?" "Over for her," I said. "But not for us. We'll carry what she tried to do, but we'll carry it together." I sat beside her, the cedar scent rising faintly from the bench. My father's work had held through storms before, and now it carried us through this one. He built it to last, and in a way, his hands had been here all along, steadying us when everything else shook. Paul called that evening. His voice was rough, but lighter than before. He told me he'd resigned from the board, that he couldn't keep serving under the shadow of what Cynthia had built. He thanked me, not because I'd saved him, but because I'd forced him to see his own conscience clearly. I didn't tell him he'd done the braver thing by stepping forward. He already knew. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood shifted. Meetings weren't the same stage performances anymore. People asked questions, demanded minutes, challenged motions. Cynthia never showed her face again. Rumor had it, she'd been threatened with legal action by residents who realized her invalid fines could open the board to liability. She faded from power the way she'd wielded it, without grace. As for me, I didn't become a hero. I stayed an engineer, a father, a man who refused to let shame define his daughter's story. But when I passed the clubhouse now, neighbors waved instead of whispering. And when I sat on that cedar bench in the evening, I knew the legacy wasn't just my father's anymore. It was mine, carried forward in the proof that no clipboard tyrant could erase dignity once truth was laid bare. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.